Welcome. Today we're diving deep into a fascinating commentary on the Qur'an's 13th chapter, Surah Ar-Ra'd, or the Thunder. We're going to unpack Ayatollah Javadi Amoli's insights on just a single verse, but a verse that grapples with some of life's biggest questions. Why do some people prosper while others struggle? What's the real nature of happiness? And how does God's will work with our own choices? Let's get into it.
So everything we're going to talk about today, it all springs from this one verse, verse 26 of Surah Ar-Ra'd. You can think of it as our key. It touches on God's control over our sustenance, our very human tendency to get caught up in worldly pleasures, and this profound contrast between our fleeting life here and the hereafter. This single sentence really sets the stage for all the core questions we'll be tackling.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start with the very idea of proof and divine guidance. Then we'll get into the philosophy of sustenance, wealth and poverty, and connect that to divine trials and justice. After that, we're going to spend a good amount of time on two powerful Quranic stories about truth and falsehood. This will lead us right into that tricky relationship between God's will and our own choices, and we'll wrap it all up by looking at the final reckoning.
Okay, our first section, proof and divine guidance. Right off the bat, the source text lays down a really powerful principle. Genuine guidance is never about just accepting things blindly. No, it has to be built on a solid foundation of clear, undeniable proof, an intellectual conviction that really satisfies the human mind.
According to this commentary, the absolute foundation of all divine guidance is something called Burhan. The text really emphasizes that the Quran isn't just a book of rules or stories, it's fundamentally a book of proof. Its main job is to establish truth in a way that's intellectually solid and clicks with our own reason. You see, the guidance of the prophets themselves was always rooted in this same idea of presenting clear proof to people. Okay, let's pause for a second on this term because it is absolutely crucial. Burhan isn't just any old evidence. In Islamic philosophy, it's a very specific kind of argument. It's a demonstration that starts from premises that are known and certain, and it leads you to a conclusion that is also certain. It's the kind of proof that doesn't just suggest something might be true, it logically proves it, leading to a state of absolute certainty, or yaqeen. This is really the bedrock of the Quran's intellectual appeal.
Now, this is interesting. The text points out a crucial difference, almost like two levels of understanding. On one level, you have universal cognition. This is a basic awareness that pretty much everyone has, whether they're an expert or not. But then the commentary points to a higher level, exclusive cognition. This is that deeper knowledge you only get from engaging with Burhan, and it's presented as the true foundation of a solid, reasoned faith, something totally different from a belief you just inherit from your culture.
So how does this guidance actually get to us? Well, the commentary lays out three channels that all work together. First, God speaks directly to our fitra, which is our innate, built-in nature that already has a sense of a higher power and basic morality. Second, for the thinkers, the philosophers, there's the specific, structured Burhan. And third, there's the Qur'an itself, which brilliantly does both. It speaks to our gut intuition while also providing these rigorous intellectual proofs, which makes it a complete form of guidance for everyone.
All right, let's shift gears and move into our second section. We're now turning to the heart of our verse, the philosophy of sustenance. This gets into one of the most real-world aspects of faith, and one that people often ask about. Why are some people well off and others aren't? Is it a sign that God is pleased or displeased? Or is there something else going on entirely?
So the verse says Allah extends, the word is basat, and restricts, that's qadr, provision, and qadr also has this sense of measuring or portioning out. The big question the commentary really digs into is, what's the divine wisdom here? What's the philosophy behind these ups and downs?
You see, the text makes it clear that both of these, expansion or bast, and constriction or qad, they aren't random. They're both part of a single divine system. Having more isn't just a blessing, it's a test to see if you'll be grateful and responsible. And having less isn't just a hardship, it's a test of your patience and faith. The commentary argues that both situations are tools God uses for our spiritual growth, designed to bring out and shape who we really are.
And just to make sure nobody walks away thinking this is all about fatalism, the text brings in this incredibly powerful saying attributed to Imam Ali. It says, "He who finds water and soil, the basic tools for production, yet remains poor, Allah has distanced him." I mean, that's a profound condemnation of being lazy or passive. It clarifies that while God designs the overall system, He's also given us the tools. Failing to use those God-given resources is a human failure, not some divine decree that you must be poor. And then the commentary does something fascinating. It basically paints this really detailed psychological profile of us, using different verses from the Qur'an to show how flawed our responses to these tests often are. When things are good, we tend to get arrogant and turn away, acting like we're totally self-sufficient. But when hardship hits, suddenly we're experts in long, poetic prayers. When things get better after a tough time, our joy is over the top and we forget everything. And when the hardship is our own fault, we just collapse into despair. It's a cycle that shows a faith that's totally conditional on our worldly situation.
And if you look at the source text here, you can see how the author is meticulously pulling these verses together from all over the Qur'an. This shows a method of interpretation that looks at themes. It proves this psychological profile isn't just a one-off observation, but a recurring theme that's deeply analyzed. The Qur'an is basically giving us a diagnosis of the human condition. Our spiritual state is often a hostage to our material state, and that is precisely what the divine tests of Bast and Qadra are meant to fix.
Okay, so this all leads us perfectly into our third topic, divine trials and justice. We've established that these ups and downs in life are tests. Now, let's see how this connects to the bigger idea of divine justice and the whole purpose of our life here.
Now, it's really important to get this right. When the verse says they rejoice in the worldly life, the commentary is quick to point out that this isn't about condemning happiness itself. The issue is the source and the kind of joy. When your happiness comes only from worldly things, and you completely forget where they came from and what comes next in the hereafter, that's diagnosed as a spiritual problem. It's a sign that you've mistaken the tool for the goal, the temporary for the eternal.
So if that's the problem, this short-sighted worldly attachment, what's the solution the Qur'an offers? Well, it presents this powerful counter-narrative. It's not about rejecting the world, but about totally changing your relationship with your possessions. And this leads to a really crucial question. What is the divine economic model for a believer?
Okay, so check out this incredible contrast the Qur'an sets up. On one side, you have riba, or usury. From a purely worldly, mathematical view, it looks like it guarantees your wealth will increase. But the Qur'an says Allah destroys its blessing. On the other side, you have sadaqat, or charity, which looks like a loss. But the Qur'an says Allah gives increase for it, making it grow. Is described as giving a goodly loan to God himself, a loan he promises to pay back, multiplied many, many times over. This just completely flips the worldly logic of hoarding and introduces a divine economy based on giving and circulating wealth.
All right, now we get to something really powerful that the Qur'an does and that the commentary analyzes in amazing detail, the use of parables. And these aren't just simple stories. They're these profound, layered illustrations of deep spiritual truths, especially the clash between truth and falsehood. So the first big parable we're looking at, it's taken right from this surah, Ar-Ra'd. It's the parable of the rainwater and the foam. It's a really beautiful and deeply symbolic metaphor for what divine revelation is like and how fleeting and shallow falsehood is. The text really dives into this metaphor, and it's so vivid. God sends rain down from the sky, and the riverbeds and valleys fill up, each one according to its own size and capacity. And as the water rushes along, it carries this big, puffy foam on the surface. This image is then used to explain the fundamental relationship between what's true and what's false.
Okay, let's break this down because every part of this image means something. The pure water coming from the sky, that represents divine truth, revelation, real knowledge. The valleys represent our hearts and minds, and this is key. Each valley receives water based on its capacity. Some hearts are vast and deep, they can absorb a lot of truth, while others are shallow. Now the foam, which is all you see, it's noisy, it sits on top, but it has zero substance, that represents falsehood, vanity, and deception. The parable ends by saying the foam disappears in a flash, but the water, the part that benefits people, that remains and nourishes the earth. Truth has substance and lasts. Falsehood is all surface level and just fades away.
And then the commentary does something brilliant. It connects this parable to another, maybe even more famous one from Surah Al-Kahf, the story of the two gardens. This story works like a case study, a human drama that shows the principles of sustenance, testing, and truth we've been talking about. The author brings it in to show that this is a universal Quranic idea.
And in these gardens, you basically have two completely opposite worldviews personified. The believer's life is fruitful because it's rooted in being grateful and recognizing God. The disbeliever's garden, even though it looks impressive on the outside, is built on a rotten foundation of arrogance. He thinks his success is all his own doing, that he's a genius, and he fools himself into thinking his wealth will last forever, completely forgetting about God and the hereafter.
And this one line, this one quote right here, it gets to the absolute core of the disbeliever's mistake. He enters his garden while being unjust to himself, which in the Quran's language means denying his own true nature as a created, dependent, mortal being. To deny God is first and foremost to be unjust to your own self. And his statement, "I do not think this will ever perish," just reveals his core problem, this delusional belief that the material world is permanent and that he has power over it.
And as you can see in the text, it lays out the entire rich conversation between these two men. The believing friend just systematically takes apart the arrogant owner's worldview. He challenges him by reminding him where he came from dust, of God's ultimate power, and of how important it is to attribute all success to God by saying, "Masha'Allah," what God has willed. This conversation really maps out the two intellectual and spiritual roads that are available to every single one of us.
And that conversation, it's the perfect setup for our fifth section, which tackles one of the oldest, toughest questions in all of theology, the relationship between divine will and human choice.
Right? This is the classic question. If God's will is supreme, as the believer in the story says when he exclaims, "Mashallah," then how are we truly responsible for what we do? How can the arrogant garden owner be blamed if his disbelief was ultimately part of God's larger will?
And what's so amazing is that the commentary argues that the answer is already baked right into the parables we just looked at. God sends the rain, that's the opportunity, the revelation, the means, that is the divine act. But the capacity of the valley to receive that water is its own thing. In the same way, God provides the fertile land for the garden. But the gratitude or arrogance of the owner in response to that blessing, that is where human choice comes in. You could say God provides the stage and the props, but we're the ones who choose how to act.
So let's look at what the believer does. His response is basically a roadmap for the correct choice. First, he grounds his friend in reality by reminding him of his humble origins from dust. Then, he makes this powerful declaration of tawhid, affirming Allah as his Lord with no partners, which means he doesn't associate his own ego, his wealth, or his power with God's. This perspective, this conscious choice to see reality for what it is what decides a person's ultimate destiny.
And that, of course, brings us to our final section. Where does all of this lead? What are the ultimate consequences of these choices? The hereafter and the final reckoning.
Well, the parable doesn't pull any punches. A disaster strikes. The arrogant man's garden is completely wiped out, and his reaction is pure worldly regret. He's wringing his hands over the money he lost. He regrets his financial loss, but there's no sign that he regrets his spiritual mistake, his disbelief. Even in total ruin, his focus is still on the material stuff.
So you see, this destruction of the garden, it's not just a sad ending to a story. It's a powerful metaphor, a kind of small-scale preview of the ultimate ruin that's waiting for those who deny the hereafter. The arrogant owner had specifically said, "I don't think the hour will ever be established." The collapse of his garden is a direct, real-world consequence of his worldview, a sign of the total collapse that's waiting for him on the Day of Judgment. And then the commentary brings it all back home, back to Surah Ar-Ra'd, which lays out the two final destinations with this really chilling clarity. For those who respond to their Lord, who accept the Burhan, and live a life of gratitude, the best reward, al-Husna, is waiting for them. But for those who don't respond, the punishment is so absolute that even if they owned everything on earth, and then some, they couldn't use it to buy their way out. Their final home is hell, described as a miserable resting place.
So in the end, the source text pulls all these threads together. The deep theological arguments, the psychological profiles, the detailed parables, they're not just abstract ideas. They're presented as a clear lesson, a powerful guide, especially for the ulul albab, those with sound understanding, those who are willing to think past the superficial foam to see the nourishing water of truth that lies underneath. Now that leaves us with this one final, really profound question to think about. After this deep dive into the divine system of sustenance, the fleeting nature of falsehood, and the stark choice between two ways of seeing the world, what's the core message? Maybe it's that this worldly life, with all of its ups and downs, is the garden that each of us has been given. And every single day, with every response, whether it's gratitude or arrogance, we're choosing which one of those two owners we're going to be.